New Year's Eve in the Bronx felt like an orchestra of small things refusing to stop. Fireworks stitched the sky into bright, impatient seams. Sirens wavered in the distance. In a narrow studio on the third floor of a brick building, a baby breathed, and a mother counted coins like they were petals to be plucked one by one. Clara Whitmore had $3.27. She had a single bowl, a chipped spoon, and an empty can of powdered formula with its metallic ring clinging to the counter like a discarded moon. Lily, 8 months and volatile with hunger, had given up on sleep an hour earlier and now hiccuped between sobs. Clara's hands were steady in a way that came from repetition. She warmed water, shook the bottle, checked the temperature, and listened to the tiny whoop of dissatisfaction when the nipple pinched. Her hands trembled only when she set the can down and saw the last smudge of powder stuck to its rim. She had one number stored in her phone that felt like a rope. Evelyn Taus, director of the community shelter who had taken Clara in the winter she'd slept on a gym mat 2 years ago. Evelyn's number was a long, reliable thing in Clara's contacts. When the rent ballooned and the daycare called to say Lily's spot was contingent on a fee Clara could not pay, Evelyn had said, "We'll figure it out." It had not been a promise of money, never that, but it had been a promise of a way through. When Clara opened her messages that night, she typed with a thumb that felt too big for the smallness of the request. She did not like asking. Pride had been her companion through layoffs and payday delays. She had resigned from Harmon Social Services months before because she'd argued, quietly and then not so quietly, about invoices that looked wrong. Her resignation letter had been an act of self-protection and of conscience. It had not filled the fridge. "Eve, I don't know if you can help. I'm out of formula. I have $3.27. Lily is starving. Can you send $50? I can pay you back next week. Sorry to ask. C." She hit send and stared at the screen until the blue bubble showed delivered. Outside, fireworks made the windows glow and then go dark. The building creaked. Lily hiccuped again and then coughed, a sound that pried open Clara's chest. She waited for Evelyn's reply for the quick, comforting text. When silence stretched, Clara tried to breathe around it. It could be the holiday. It could be Evelyn asleep in a shelter office with a cup of bad coffee, already balancing last-minute intake lists. Clara told herself stories to slow the panic. The shelter had run out of money before and gotten a donation. Someone always had an extra can somewhere. The phone vibrated once on the table and fell face down. Clara, thinking it was Evelyn, picked it up with fingers that made the glass warm. The message that had just arrived did not have the steady, familiar cadence of Evelyn's texts. It was short, clear, and cut like a small blade. "Where are you?" She blinked. The number on screen wasn't Evelyn's at all. The area code was right, but the digits were off by 2. Clara's stomach dropped. She reread her outgoing message and felt a hollowing shame that crowded up like hot air. Wrong number. She should delete the thread. She should go back to the kitchen and coax the formula powder from the bottom of the can. She should pretend nothing had happened and save the indignity for when she was alone. Instead, she typed because the baby needed something to do with her hands. "I'm at 42A 109th Street. My name is Clara. This is for Evelyn. Please ignore if wrong." There was a pause that stretched like an elastic. Outside, fireworks muffled into thin cheers. The city's breath changed from celebration to the slow burn of the early hours. A moment later, the reply came. "Stay there." Clara's thumb hovered over the screen. Stay where she was? The rational mind supplied obvious possibilities. A prank, someone with a gun, a scam. She scanned the peephole. The stairwell smelled of damp and old smoke. A neighbor's small Christmas tree blushed through their window. Lily, half asleep now, stirred when the floorboard above them creaked. Clara blew air through her teeth and felt the urge to laugh, which might have been hysteria if not for the way the child curled closer to her chest. "If this setup hooked you, tap like." She kept the phone in her pocket and cracked the door an inch. The corridor smelled of bleach and fried onions. A man stood under the yellow light of the landing, holding a grocery bag. He was bundled in a dark coat, despite the clammy warmth of the hallway. He looked like someone who had never once had to line up at the food pantry. Proper shoes. A watch glinting like a small moon. He looked like someone who belonged in a different story. "Clara?" he asked. She knew him without knowing him. The voice was low, practiced with gentleness. He had the kind of hands that spoke of control but not of calluses. He said nothing of his name. He had folded the plastic bag open, and in it, the sight that made Clara's throat knot, tins of formula, a box of ready-made bottles, fresh fruit, and a paper cup with a coffee lid. The formula can glittered like an impossible promise. "I'm sorry," she said. "You must have the wrong door." "You sent a message," he said. His eyes were earnest in a way that decided to be honest. He kept the bag extended as if it were a thing that could be gently placed on the threshold of her life, and then withdrawn if she didn't accept. Clara thought about slamming the door and about taking the groceries and running, about the way Evelyn would have said, "No shame, we help each other." Her pride tightened into a fist. "I don't take charity," she heard herself say before she knew she would. It was old armor. The man's mouth tilted with such empathy that something in Clara gave. "Take it for Lily," he said. "I don't want anything. I just—" He paused and looked at the stairwell as if searching for the right words. "I used to be on the other end of calls like this. Tonight I'm not going to let anyone else wake up hungry." He left his name on the back of a business card, Ethan Mercer. It was printed in a plain, almost anonymous font that somehow made the name feel larger. Clara slid the card into an apron pocket and closed the door with chicken-fingered care. The groceries clutched to her chest like contraband. Lily's face smoothed as the bottle warmed. She fed greedily, eyes hooded with relief. Clara sat on the floor and breathed. She could feel a strange pressure clinging to her shoulders, like the weight of all the nights she'd pretended not to need. She did not sleep. The city kept popping outside like someone flipping through an exuberant, impatient book. Clara patched the can's torn lid with tape and poured the remaining powder into a Ziploc. She counted bills again and imagined ways to make $50 by Friday. Somewhere in the edges of the room, the business card sat like a bright currency. She told herself she would not call him. She told herself she'd return the card and tell him she didn't need charity. At 2 a.m, she texted the number with a short message. "Thank you. Name?" "I didn't get to ask." She wanted to speak the man's name into the dark the way one might call a rescue by its name. Ethan read it in the penthouse at the same minute. The city down below was a scatter of embers. The party on the neighboring terrace had finally thinned, and the sound of late laughter had become intermittent. He had been awake for hours, a habit that had crept up on him like a second skin. Work, worry, the odd ache between his shoulder blades that had begun the year his mother had left. He held the phone, and the message folded into his chest more tightly than any coat. The face of the woman who had written, he had not seen it, arrived in his mind in flashes. Small hands, an empty can, a baby with a hunger that sounded like a small, precise demand. He pushed himself away from the window and told Marcus to ring the number and trace it. Marcus had half a dozen ways of being useful. He could find a forgotten file buried in a network of dead servers. He could make a hotel bill disappear from a ledger with the right paperwork. He was also, quietly, ethical, or at least he had his own set of rules. When Ethan told him why, Marcus did not ask whether it was a publicity stunt or another of Ethan's midnight impulses. He simply set his fingers to a keyboard and began to pull at the loose thread. "I don't want to make a show of it," Ethan said before Marcus could answer. "If it's a scam, we walk. No headlines, no announcements." "I know," Marcus said. "I'll get the tower ping and match it to a billing address. If it's a public listing, we'll have an address in 10 minutes. Marcus had been Ethan's right hand for years. He had watched Ethan become the man who built towers of work, and then wondered if the towers had rooms in them where loneliness could not find a way in. He also knew where Ethan's particular tenderness sat, just under the surface of control. When asked where it came from, Ethan gave short answers. My mother. Childhood. A room where heat was rare. The few times Marcus had gotten the full story, because Ethan trusted him, he had learned about a woman who had stayed and worked and sewn, who had died before she could see the last of her debts cleared. It was enough to set Ethan's jaw on an odd, brittle line. The trace came back with more than a location. Marcus was thorough. The ping showed a cluster of cell towers near Clara's address. Public property records confirmed a tenancy at the building number Clara had included. Marcus sent a photo of the landlord's listing and after a quiet moment texted Ethan. "She's on the 3rd floor. No police alerts, no outstanding flags." Ethan stripped off the fine coat he had been wearing and threw on a thick sweater. He did not dress for anonymity. There was no point pretending he could be anything but himself. He took the spare bag of formula from the pantry, the tin shining like punctuation, and left the penthouse with a man who called himself Marcus, carrying a map of the city that had been etched in his memory since childhood. Clara watched from the stairwell as the elevator door opened and a man in a coat stepped out into the winter air. He glanced up at the building's faded name and then at her door. When he knocked, his hands did not tremble. "You okay?" he asked, this time offering a hand, not a bag. He had brought a small tower of groceries, a brand of formula Clara had never been able to afford before. He smelled faintly of coffee and citrus. He did not pose as a savior. He posed as a person who had been given one small chance to correct a memory. They sat on the threadbare rug and talked 3 sentences at a time between Lily's need. The man, Ethan, didn't ask intrusive things. He did not ask how much she earned or why she had left Harmon. She told him in small pieces because telling a stranger the underside of your life felt like emptying pockets of stones. She had been an accountant, briefly, at the nonprofit that had supported several community kitchens. She had noticed payments that did not make sense, small vendor checks that bounced into accounts that never delivered. She had argued until her voice was hoarse and then resigned when no one would review the ledgers with more than a passing curiosity. "It wasn't a crime," she said. "Not exactly, mostly whispers. I made a scene and they called me unprofessional." Ethan listened with the kind of patience that felt like a presence. "If you ever wanted to go back," he said, "we could use someone who notices." He moved the phrase lightly, as if it were dangerous to name it outright. Clara's laugh escaped like a cough. "You don't know what you're offering," she said. "I do," Ethan said. "Special projects. An audit-like role, but not the kind that wears a tie to a hearing. If you wanted some steady hours and a paycheck, I could make that happen." She folded the business card open and folded her fingers over the name as if it were a fragile thing. Accepting help felt, to her, like a small death. It meant lowering the shield she had painstakingly shaped so no one could tell her she was not enough. It also meant a roof when the landlord's patience thinned and a place in daycare for Lily. "You're offering a job," she said finally, voice small. "Yes," he answered. "No strings, just a role, and food in the meantime." She could see 1,000 ways to refuse and still keep her dignity. She could also see an arithmetic that led to a different life. Rent paid, a regular paycheck, a seat at a table where decisions were recorded, and where someone listened to the names of vendors. She slept with the card under her pillow that night, as if proximity could transmute an ally into a certainty. Days passed like a cautious truce. Ethan called once to confirm a name. Marcus sent a polite email to verify her references. Clara asked Evelyn for permission to apply for a job, and was told in a voice thick with relief that she ought to take any door that opened. Evelyn's reply came later with a text that was both a benediction and a warning. "Be careful of people who shine." The interview at Mercer Capital was a study in contrasts. The lobby's marble floor reflected the chandeliers like slices of sky. Security checked bags with a ritualized civility. Clara, who had worn the same coat for 3 winters, felt like a wrong item on the menu. She held the business card until the edges softened. Maggie Chen, who greeted her with an efficient smile, led her to a room where the walls were lined with framed donations and carefully posed photos of board members at charity galas. It was a place designed so everyone in it felt that the right thing had been done, and yet the air itself held the metallic tang of calculation. Maggie asked direct questions about Harmon, how long she had been there, why she had left, whether she had access to internal ledgers. Clara answered exactly. She did not offer more than was asked. Honesty had been her way in every job she'd held. It had been the thing that sometimes made her difficult in meetings where cynicism was currency. Maggie listened and took notes with a pen that scratched angrily across paper. Special projects, Maggie explained, using the phrase like a neat package. We have some grants we administer directly and some that are managed by partner organizations. That means layers, vendors, subcontracts, funding disbursements. We need someone to look with fresh eyes, someone who can read between the lines. Why me? Clara asked. Because you saw something at Harmon and walked away instead of accepting the fistful of assurances most people hand to themselves, Maggie said. Her voice was not unkind. Also because Mr. Mercer has a particular interest in this kind of oversight. He believes in on-the-ground honesty. When Ethan entered the room, he did not make a show. He crossed the distance between them with the economy of someone who had practiced small, meaningful gestures. He sat across from Clara, and for a moment the city outside made him a silhouette in a bright window. He told her that he had been listening to the message she had sent that night because it had landed on his phone by mistake. He told her he had come because he could not sleep until he had tried to help. He did not make a speech about philanthropy or charity. He made one sentence. If you want the job, you'll have autonomy. You'll report to me on progress, and to no one who asks you to turn your head. Clara felt a flush come to her face that she could not wholly attribute to the room's heat. An offer like this, at the center of power, came with its own complications. It would blur lines. It would build strange obligations. She thought of the nights she had sat at her kitchen table and tried to stitch a budget from a pile of coin. She thought of Lily's small mouth opening for food. She thought of Evelyn's watchful face. I won't be anyone's charity case, she said. You won't have to be, Ethan said. I want you to work. I want your skill. If that's not something you want, say so. Clara signed the employment forms with a hand that had learned to steady itself for numbers. Her start date was given with the kind of promptness that suggested the matter had already been placed into a calendar and given a small, official gravity. She accepted a modest salary. She accepted the title, Special Projects Auditor, though she did not entirely know what that would mean in practice. For Lily, she accepted child care assistance and a temporary grant that would ease the coming month. No instant salvation, but a scaffold. A line on a ledger that read, Assistance given, not mercy dispensed. Her first day at Mercer began with a tour that felt like a guided orbit. She sat in a glass office and opened a folder that Maggie set before her like a gateway. The folder contained a stack of invoices, a spreadsheet printout, a list of partner vendors, and a small note that read, Start here. Clara's fingers traced the typed text, then the names of vendors, some of which made a small, familiar alarm ring in the back of her mind. Harmon was on the list, quiet and ordinary in print. So were dozens of other small nonprofits, each paired with an array of vendor names that looked like a scatter of islands. Nutrify Now, Bright Plate, Children's Reach, Little Fields, and among them a cluster of names that felt like a gray smear. Companies named in a way that tried to sound civic but read as advertisement. Graymark Solutions LLC, Riverbend Logistics, Chandler & Sons LLC. She began to pull at the thread. Small checks here, large deposits there. Circuitous payments that moved in loops and circled back into accounts with names no one could match to a storefront. A handful of vendors had addresses that traced to a P.O. box. Another dozen had been registered in the names of shell corporations with directors who listed no clear presence. The first page alone suggested not a single act of greed but a pattern. Money intended for feeding children and tending programs, leaving accounts in a way that did not correlate to services rendered. She felt the old familiar rise again, the way discovery flexed in her chest like a muscle. Where other people felt fear at a bigger picture, Clara felt steadiness. Numbers had always been sympathetic. They would tell the truth if someone asked them the right questions. Take your time, Maggie said, and document everything. If you find anything that concerns you, we'll route it through legal. We're careful. Careful felt like a neutral word until you put it against the urgency of child hunger and small nonprofits whose bank accounts had been bled. Clara set the folder under the light of a lamp and began to map the vendors. She made a list, not of crimes but of oddities. Recurring payments to dormant entities, invoices with vague descriptions, deposits that arrived just after board meetings where disbursements had been approved. There was, she saw, a small but steady transfer that tugged at her memory, the kind of slight misalignment she had once noticed at Harmon. A vendor named Harmon Supplies appeared as a payee in several files, but the details did not match the goods delivered. The same vendor appeared in Mercer accounts with a pattern of mini payments routed via another name, Douglas Crane Consulting. Clara stopped, breath forgotten. Douglas Crane. The name had a shape to it. The kind of man who wore tailored suits in warm colors and smiled with the ease of someone who had been trained to be trusted. Claire had never met him, but the name suggested presence in the rooms where money was discussed with the level of reverence usually reserved for art. The ledger had the name printed in crisp type. Her heart gave the odd lurch of a person who has found a coincidence that refuses to be a coincidence. She felt the weight of the paper in her hand, and then the sudden childish fear that came with thinking you had stumbled into something you were not meant to see. Her first instinct was to call Evelyn and ask a woman she trusted to say, "Did I do the right thing?" Her second instinct was to grit her teeth and follow the thread like a hound. That night she walked home with a folder under her arm, and the city's chill clearing the fuzz from her head. She imagined, in a threadbare way, how money could be moved like a tide through small channels until it pooled into someone's private marsh. She imagined the clockwork of it, invoices, shell companies, and people content to believe in the charity of a good name. She also, unbidden, thought of Ethan's hands at her door and how they had held a bag of groceries like a sacrament. His intervention had been personal, motivated by a childhood memory, an urge to make right a hunger he had once felt. There was no omniscience in him. There was, instead, the kind of empathy that walked toward things other people ignored. She liked this about him. She disliked the way power could turn kindness into leverage. She did not mistake the generosity for purity. When she turned the corner and the elevator chewed upward toward her floor, a shadow moved in the entrance to Mercer as if to greet her. Douglas Crane stood framed by the atrium glass, tall, deliberate, the kind of presence that was both applause and challenge. He caught her eye, and there was a polite lift to his smile, the one people used when their mouths were doing work different from their eyes. She felt a prickle in her skin like the warning before rain. He did not speak to her then. He moved toward a line of men in suits and handshakes, and the room swallowed him like an organ. For a moment she had the absurd sensation of standing before a stage door after the curtain had dropped. Back in her apartment, Lily slept in a heap of blankets, small and steady, oblivious to the ledgered world she had entered. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a notebook. The night pressed against the window like a question. She had taken a job to feed her child. She had taken a job because a man in a dark coat had left formula at her door. Now, in the quiet hours, she realized she had taken a job that might pull at the seams of people who had power. She traced Crane's name again and again until the letters blurred into meaning. There were practicalities to navigate, security clearances, non-disclosure clauses, the small whisper of a contract that promised to protect proprietary information and to bind her to confidentiality. Maggie walked her through the clauses with corporate patience. "These are standard," Maggie told her. "You'll be exposed to documents that require discretion, but we want you to be able to report freely to legal if you have concerns." Clara signed. The pen felt like an instrument of both liberation and risk. The days in the office were a montage of fluorescence and low conversation. Clara found that she liked the steady rhythm of looking for anomalies. She pulled together vendor lists and traced the loops of payments. She saw how a $500 check could disappear into a complex of transfers that evaporated into a bank account with no physical address. She learned the language Maggie used: partner organization, sub-award, direct versus indirect costs, without letting it flatten her own instincts. Her notes were messy at first, then precise, a map of oddities. One late night she stayed past everyone else. The building emptied and the city outside softened to a hush. On a stack of invoices labeled for a child nutrition grant, she saw a pattern emerge: small disbursements, irregular scheduling, and a recurring vendor name that returned like an uninvited guest. The name was Chandler & Sons, LLC. It sat in the register like a ghost. Each time it appeared, A tiny percentage of the grant funds was moved out of program budgets and into accounts that had little or no recipients listed. The amounts were too small to alarm a board, but large enough, compounded, to form a stream. Clara copied the entries into a spreadsheet she color-coded by currency, by vendor legitimacy, by physical address. The red squares clustered in one corner. She felt a familiar and fierce satisfaction as a pattern resolved into sense. On her bus ride home, she imagined calling Evelyn and saying, "I was right." She imagined Evelyn's hands clenching and then unfurling into a plan. Clara considered briefly the other end of intervention: exposure, news stories, cameras. She thought of what could happen if she brought this to light. She thought of Crane's smile. She thought of the way Ethan's kindness had lit a small, dangerous path. A text arrived from an unmarked number she now knew well. "Marcus, don't go alone if you want to pursue this. We can set a desk for you in-house tomorrow." The line of Marcus's message struck her as both promise and boundary. She responded with a simple, honest note. "I'm not sure what I've found yet." She did not send the spreadsheet. She did not forward the folder of invoices across a network she did not control. She slept like someone who had taken the first step up a long set of stairs. What she did not know, even as the plan began to unfurl, was how much attention her discovery would command. The ledger was only a strand. Money had weight in certain rooms, and sometimes weight was mistaken for truth. Clara had the endurance to follow the numbers. She did not yet know how quickly people would try to knot those numbers into silence. Ethan noticed the way she worked. He watched in a manner that was almost paternal, not controlling but observant. He brought Lily jars of pureed sweet potato on his way into the office, and left them with Maggie with a quiet request that seemed to embarrass Clara while warming her at the same time. He called once and asked if she needed anything, and his voice was a low instrument that, over time, braided into the static of her days. When Douglas Crane's office door had clicked shut behind him, he had not been thinking of a woman from the Bronx. He had been thinking of the meeting he would chair tomorrow, of grant allocations and partner relationships to be managed delicately to keep donors comfortable. He liked order. He liked predictable channels. A pattern in spending that eroded those channels could be seen as a risk to the kind of empire he was paid to steward. He was aware, in the way people in power are aware of weather forming at the edge of vision, that everything could be rearranged by one stubborn fact. He did not yet know that fact would be the name of a woman who had once counted $3.27 on a kitchen table, while fireworks made the world bright and then dark. On Clara's second week at Mercer, she arrived early and found an envelope slipped under her office door. Inside was a note printed on crisp stationery. "Please be careful. Do not trust appearances. Signed, E.T." She smiled despite herself. Ethan's note felt like a small protection talisman. It also felt like an official marker. "You are now under observation." It made her cheeks warm and her palms sweat. She folded the note and slid it into her notebook next to the spreadsheet, where the red squares glowed like coals. She opened the ledger again with a steadiness that came from having little left to lose, and now, the steadying support of someone who had the power to listen. That afternoon, someone in the meetings department asked her a question about a vendor whose invoices she had been cataloging. "Do you have a moment?" the woman asked, and in her voice there was an ordinary curiosity that did not yet know whether it was dangerous to be curious. Clara closed her laptop slowly and looked up. The game had shifted. The pattern she had found, small payments, shell names, recurring accounts, was no longer only a private discovery. It would be a light that, once turned on, would illuminate rooms people had preferred to keep dim. She inhaled and imagined for a moment standing at the edge of a sea break, watching water find its new course. At the end of the day, she took the subway back to the Bronx with the weight of an unopened envelope in her bag. She had told no one about the spreadsheets beyond Maggie and the insistent, practical Marcus. In the darkness under the city, the roof slid past like low teeth. She imagined Crane's smile again and the precise way his hands folded when he shook them. A door in the stairwell opened and a neighbor she knew only by the emergency contact list poked his head out. "You look exhausted," he said. "You got a job?" She wanted to say everything. the midnight knock, the formula bag, the name in the ledger. Instead, she said, "Yes, for now." And then, "For Lily." The neighbor's eyes shifted to the sleeping child and softened. "Good," he said. "Good for both of you." She went into her apartment and sat on the living room floor. Lily slept with her mouth open a little. Clara lay her head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling where the plaster had cracked in a starburst years ago. She thought about the business card, Ethan's note, the ledger, and Douglas Crane's smooth smile. She had accepted a job that would ask her to look where others had chosen not to look. She had also accepted an employer who had come through a wrong number and whose own past had led him to a midnight doorstep. Outside, a stray firework burst like a reminder. Clara closed her eyes and imagined a series of small, defiant acts. One person refusing to be silent, another person tracing a phone number with care, a community shelter that folded arms around a struggling mother. If things went well, she told herself as if bargaining with fate, then Lily would have a different list of hardships in her head. If things went badly, the ledger would know the truth, and the truth would matter. She slept finally with the ledger under the lamp's thin glow. Dawn came like a question. Clara rose with Lily at her hip and walked through a day that hummed with ordinary things. A note from Evelyn checking in, a quiet compliment from Maggie on her diligence, a phone call from Marcus offering to arrange a desk with secure access in legal if she preferred. She split the day into tasks and did each one with the measurable patience of someone who knows numbers will eventually speak. That evening, as she pushed Lily's stroller down the block, she saw Crane across the street through the window of a car that had slowed at a crosswalk. He was on his phone, looking every inch the part he had been hired to play. Untroubled, authoritative, a man whose life was an arrangement of soft luxuries. He lifted his head, and for a second their eyes met as the light changed. He gave a brief, practiced smile, the kind that closed a conversation before it began. The light changed. The car moved on. Clara crossed the street and kept counting, $1, $2, $3.27, like a litany that had anchors in the small emergencies of her life. The warning came the next morning as a series of small, precise things. An anonymous voicemail left on her desk at Mercer, with too calm a voice asking whether she was aware of certain discrepancies and whether she meant to cause trouble. A note tucked into her file labeled "Please be careful," signed E.T. reappeared as if to remind her she was no longer alone, and late that afternoon in the stairwell of her apartment, a man lingered a half-second too long outside her door, and then walked away when he saw Lily in the carrier, her fists working on the air like small suns. Clara felt the skin raise on the back of her neck. The ledger was a map now, not just a list. Someone was reading the map the way people read weather, adjusting their plans. At the office, the pattern she had traced began to bloom into something that could be presented. Maggie had argued for care, but when Clara showed her a clean printout of a set of payments routed through Chandler and Sons, and then through an account linked to Douglas Crane Consulting, Maggie's pen slowed. "We need corroboration," she said. "We need the originals. We need witness testimony if we can get it. Legal needs to chain this so it can't be dismissed as an error." Legal was deliberate and slow in the way of institutions that knew the cost of mistakes. Maggie introduced Clara to Helen Park, senior counsel for Mercer Capital, a woman who spoke in a way that suggested she measured everything thrice. Helen read the spreadsheets as if they were foreign languages and then folded them into a series of emails to an external auditor. "We'll open a quiet inquiry," she said. "No press, no leaks. We'll also present this to the Office of Inspector General and, if warranted, coordinate with the FBI." The mention of the Bureau tightened Clara's stomach and clarified her resolve. It was possible the work she had started could lead somewhere far beyond the boardroom's polite dismay. It could put families' names on lists and make headlines. It could, if not handled wisely, put her in the middle of a storm she had not planned to fight. "Do you want Marcus to set up a secure desk?" Maggie asked. "Yes," Clara said, "and make sure anything on that desk is backed up. Offline, if you can. I don't want this living on a network anyone can touch." Marcus didn't ask why she was particular. He simply arranged it, and a week later she had a desk in legal surrounded by frosted glass and a pair of headphones that muffled the world. Marcus's IT team had impressed on her the basics of chain of custody: photographs of invoices, stamped copies, time-coded downloads. She learned to sign each document like it was a promise. Tommy Rise came the following week like a half-breath of luck. He appeared at the coffee station the day after Clara had stayed at her desk until midnight and had printed a ledger of shell companies that made her head spin. He looked thinner than the photos on LinkedIn, older, a man who had aged into the sort of regret that wore itself quietly. But when he stood in the doorway hesitantly and said, "Ms. Whitmore?" the air in the room changed. Tommy had been an operations manager at Harmon once, the kind of man whose job was to smooth edges and sign invoices without asking too many questions. He had drifted into something darker, and then out of it, spending a year at an out-of-state firm until the small hands of habit pushed him back into proximity with the community they had once served. He had a folder and a tremor in his thumb. I didn't want to get involved," he said, voice low. "But when I saw this on your desk..." He tapped the spreadsheet as if it might bite. "I thought maybe I should tell someone who would actually do something about it." He produced a thumb drive with most of the thumbnails of the files Courtney had once used to temper a panic. "I deleted things," he admitted. "I thought it would sweep it under. But I kept copies. I kept a backup. I was scared. I was paid to look away." He avoided Clara's gaze when he said paid. His eyes confessed a small mercy. He had been paid out of accounts that did not belong to any program. Marcus handled the forensic part with the skill of a surgeon. The thumb drive yielded deleted metadata, emails with truncated headers, documents with marginal notes that read like a quiet diary, overages to DC account, and release via Chandler. The documents threaded into one another like veins. Tommy's evidence added names and dates in ways that made the numbers speak: who signed, who approved, when a check cleared. Tommy's hesitation came with a cost. He feared retaliation. He knew what a man like Douglas Crane could do to a career. He asked, haltingly, if he would be protected. Helen Park explained the mechanisms. Witness protection for cooperators was beyond corporate counsel alone. But the FBI had witness vetting in their toolkit once a formal complaint moved past a threshold. "We will not throw you in the dark," Helen said. "You will be escorted. You will be advised by federal agents." "What if he comes after me?" Tommy whispered. "Then we document that too," Maggie said. "We don't guess at threats. We show them." Tommy nodded as if that knowledge girded him. He left with a cup of coffee he hadn't finished and a promise to return to make a formal statement. Clara watched him go and felt in the way people feel after a near miss that the tide had turned. There was risk, but there was also a collective, small and slow, agreement to bear that risk together. Crane noticed the tide. He noticed small things first: a ledger pulled in legal, a request for old vendor contracts, a staffing change in the grants department. He brought the matter to Ethan in private ways that smelled like caution. They had shared decades of meetings where they learned to frame questions in comforting tones. Crane had a polished way of asking for clarifications. Ethan had a habit by then of reading between the lines. "He's being careful," Crane said at breakfast, stirring his espresso with an index finger that drew circles in the air. "This is the sort of thing that happens when you open a box and expect a cat. It's messy." Ethan watched Crane's hands. They did not tremble as he spoke. They were flat and clean. Ethan kept his own counsel. He had long since learned that one's presence alone could be leveraged into narrative. "If there's wrongdoing," Ethan said, "it will be handled. Carefully, but thoroughly." Crane smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "As long as we're careful about reputation," he said. Reputation was his currency. Reputation was the coding that let him operate in rooms that smelled of donors' best intentions. The first direct warning to Clara came in a phone call that tried the old familiar tactics. A voice with a soft corporate cadence left a message on her personal phone. "Ms. Whitmore, this is Anthony from Harmon. We've seen your name circulating. You should be careful. It's easy to mistake good intent for malice. Think about the people who will be hurt by an accusation." It was not a threat that promised violence. It was a threat that promised ruin through rumor. Clara saved the message and sent a copy to Helen. The council's reply was a small victory. File it. File everything. Build the record. When the man outside her building started asking questions about the daycare she used, asking whether she could confirm certain dates, the exchange was nervous and designed to be deniable. Clara called Marcus. He arranged for a discreet escort. It escalated the day a tabloid photographer showed up on the Mercer lobby with a camera trained on the reception glass. They had not yet gone public. Someone had leaked a line meant to unsettle. A nameless source had suggested a conflict of interest. Ethan penned a brief, tightly controlled statement and then shut his office door. "No comment is still a statement," he said, and then added softer, "We will let the facts speak. We will not perform for headlines." Clara watched her own face appear on a screen in a way that made her stomach roll. An image glimpsed through security cameras at a city coffee shop, tagged with a caption that included the hint of scandal. Her phone buzzed with offers, cameras in the hallway, a producer asking if she would tell her side. She answered none of them. She did not go on TV. She slept in snatches and rose the next day and did her work. Her refusal to perform became part of the case. The quieter the witness, the cleaner the mirror for the facts. Maggie stood in meetings and asked for patience. Helen worked with outside counsel who coordinated with an FBI field agent named Special Agent Morales, a woman with hands that wore tape on the base of her thumb from the pages she had torn at work over cases past. "I'm not here for drama," Morales said when she met Clara. Her voice was plain, not patronizing. "We're here for evidence. We'll open an investigation if the documents show probable cause. We'll seek warrants where needed. We'll keep you informed." They began to build a formal case. The pattern of payments Clara had traced was triangulated with Tommy's recovered emails. They subpoenaed bank records tied to Chandler and Sons and found they emptied into accounts with a string of shell names, accounts with minimal documentation and routing through offshore entities where permissible. Each new return on a subpoena showed a geography of obfuscation. Small transfers matched to invoices with vague descriptions, vendors with no employees listed beyond a name and a forwarding address. Douglas Crane moved like someone tightening a loop. He began to call Maggie's office more often. He asked for meetings, presented counter questions with the ease of a man rehearsed by legal counsel. He offered alternative explanations, clerical errors, miscodes, accidental double payments. He suggested that a disgruntled former employee, he hovered his chin toward Harmon without naming names, might be corrupting the system to spite the organization. At a hearing in a small conference room, Crane leaned forward and looked at Clara directly for the first time. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, voice even, "are you suggesting that I personally orchestrated financial transfers to benefit myself?" Clara felt the room shrink to the size of a single breath. She had prepared for the meeting by lining up documents in a way that made each point a hinge. She did not flinch. "No," she said, "but I'm suggesting there's a structure that facilitated those transfers, and many of the records point toward entities connected to your department." Crane smiled, but it was a smile that read as practiced bluff. "Allegations," he said. "We should be careful about allegations." They were careful. The FBI moved slowly and openly enough to avoid tipping off people who might move funds or destroy records. They secured warrants to preserve electronic logs. They interviewed Tommy under the careful auspices of federal agents who assured him he would be protected if he cooperated. The heat shifted the night the micro-recorder Maggie had prepared for the meeting captured an exchange that 1,000 memos could not replicate. They set up a session in a neutral room, arranged as a recorded sit-down with Crane under the pretense of a routine audit review. It was a controlled environment. Ethics and counsel had weighed every risk. They had legal reason to be present, and they had an agent in earshot to step in if necessary. Crane arrived with the sort of ease that masks intent. He brought Benson, a man who did accounts payable and who could speak of policy in soothing cadences. The meeting began as documentation review. Crane's tone was seasoned, his jokes small and disarming. He asked questions that sounded like curiosity and not accusation. He asked who had requested certain records. He asked why there were multiple entries for administrative processing. Clara presented the spreadsheet in a way she had rehearsed in her head until the numbers felt like a second language. She spoke plainly about transfers and P.O. boxes. She kept her sentences short. She left space for Maggie and Helen to add the technicalities. As the conversation moved, Crane's voice lowered and the veneer cracked. He began to speak about the realities of maintaining relationships with partners. Sometimes, he said, you need to move money in a way that protects ongoing work. Sometimes optics complicate good outcomes. His hands folded as he rationalized. He did not confess. He insinuated. Tommy, sitting in the room with his throat raw from having told truth to a few people already, shifted. He had been listening. He had a document in his pocket he had not yet turned over, an email chain with a subject line that read only, "Release Plan, Chandler." The chain contained signatures and a trail that led from a small vendor invoice to an account with Crane's initials in marginal notes. When Maggie asked for clarifications and Crane offered glib answers, the air in the room felt electric. Someone in the legal team toggled the recorder to high fidelity. Ethan sat just outside the room, technically not a participant, but close enough to hear the cadence. Marcus sat in a van with a laptop watching server logs in case anything went offline. Tommy stood up suddenly and handed over the paper. "This is why there were delays," he said. "This is why checks bounced." His voice was half an accusation and half a plea. Crane's face changed as if he had been slapped by evidence. For a moment he was unmoored. He groped for explanations that could hold, a word that had been polished into usefulness, administrative processing, became a brittle thing. He began to shift blame outward, to suggest the documents had been misfiled, that someone above him had signed without his knowledge, that the company names were innocent fronts. "That's impossible," he said at one point. His voice was lower now, edged with a man trying to control a narrative that wanted to run free. It was then, precisely then, that his phone buzzed with a notification he did not mean to see. In the room, a quick, careless movement from Crane, he had set his device to vibrate on the table, sent a message preview across the screen. The words were accidental but telling. "We'll reroute this before they notice. Call me." He grabbed the phone, tried to conceal it, and in doing so made an arm movement that registered on the recorder. Maggie, who had the reflexes of someone who had lived inside meetings like this for years, asked Crane to set the phone aside and gently to explain the message. Crane's jaw tightened. For a long beat there was nothing but the sound of paper and the heat of 7 people's breathing in a small room. Then Crane played a card he had used before, charm, denial, an attempt to reclaim the conversation. "There are explanations," he said. "This is bureaucratic language." Tommy, who had until now been tentative, found his voice. He described the signature stamps he had seen. He described a meeting where accounts were altered and a transfer was scheduled the day after a donor dinner. He produced a USB with bank statements that matched the dates. The federal agent present verified that the chain of evidence was intact. They had been careful to have logged each handoff. Crane's features moved through a series of small emotions, anger, calculation, then a flash of fear. He stood to leave, a motion that felt like an attempt to exit a stage before an accident. "You're making this into something it isn't," he said, voice rough now. "You'll all regret this. You have no idea what you're touching." Helen, who had the steadiness of someone who had navigated legal storms before, said calmly, "Douglas, if we have probable cause, we are required to notify authorities. We will do so." She spoke the sentence without drama, like a clerk reading off a request. Crane's mouth thinned. He turned toward the door and then hesitated as if considering whether leaving was the same as fleeing. He tried to walk out of the room. 2 federal agents had been monitoring proceedings and stood. They stepped forward and said quietly, "Mr. Crane, we'd like to ask you to remain for a few moments." Crane's response flickered between outrage and bargain. "On what basis?" he asked. He summoned a lawyer on his phone. He said in a voice meant to hold command, "I will not be detained based on innuendo." What transpired in the minutes that followed read like a slow-motion collapse. Crane, who had always operated with the assumption that optics were malleable, mismanaged the next move. In the fluster, he made a call that was connected to people outside the room. Agent Morales, sensing a risk of destruction of records, authorized the act that turned suspicion into arrest, an immediate preservation order, and a probable cause interview. Crane's phone calls were traced in real time. Wires were sealed. The building's security system was contacted. The agents were prepared. Crane realized suddenly and with a kind of animal clarity that he could not shape this narrative with old tricks. He was a man who had built a life on the choreography of influence, and the choreography had been interrupted by paper and a woman who had counted $3.27. His face crumpled in a way no smile could smooth. When officers from the FBI arrived 10 minutes later in coats that matched the winter sky, Crane's attempt to leave was physically prevented by protocol, not by spectacle. He was asked to sit, to answer a few questions, and then he was given the option of calling counsel. For someone who had spent decades moving within polite rooms, the humiliation of an escorted exit was a kind of death. "Don't think this ends with me," Crane said as he was led past the frosted glass where Clara had once sat. "You know people will pay for this." His voice had the thrum of threat, but in the corridor it sounded small. The charges came swiftly in the technical language of the law: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, and several counts tied to the misuse of funds intended for charitable programs. The press, which had been carefully kept to the margins, now arrived with a force that made the offices of Mercer lock their doors. Headlines called it a philanthropic scandal. Commentators argued about oversight and the failures of governance. Many of the stories simplified nuance into appetite. Clara read them with her hands folded over hers. The noise did little to the facts on the table. The facts were threaded with numbers and signatures, and those could not be easily undone. Crane's arrest sparked inquiries at other foundations and nonprofit partners. Audits spread like a cautious contagion. Boards convened emergency sessions. Donors called and asked hard questions about how money had moved. For every headline, a dozen quietly grateful programs rediscovered funds that had been misallocated. It was complicated and forever imperfect. Victories felt incomplete because they had cost trust. Ethan watched the fallout with an attention that bordered on reverence for the slow shape of justice. He did not announce himself in the press. He let Helen and the federal agents release statements that were precise and thin. In private, he watched Clara from a distance the way people watch someone they love perform an act of courage. He called her once, after her testimony to a grand jury, and left a message that was simple. "You did the right thing," he said. "We'll make sure that stays true." Clara's testimony before the grand jury was a small and brutal thing. She spoke plainly, about the wrong number message, about formula tins and nights she had almost called the shelter again. She spoke about ledger lines and her time at Harmon. She answered questions that circled her ethics and intentions. She did not let the council press her into a drama she had not sought. When she left the building, the long corridor swallowed her, and she felt for the first time in months the relief of one who had announced a truth she had been private about for too long. The public attention changed her life in ways that surprised her. Offers came in the night. Op-eds, television appearances, interviews that wanted to frame her as a victim or a heroine. A producer called at 2 a.m. and offered the sort of money that means doors open, but Clara pressed her phone to the counter and put it in a drawer. She did not want a platform for herself. She wanted platforms for people who lacked one. She wanted donors to answer for funds meant for feeding children, not for making her a character in someone else's story. Ethan, for his part, pushed the idea of a structural response. He convened a quiet meeting with Helen, Maggie, and members of Mercer's philanthropic council. "There's a need," he said, looking at Clara across the table. She seemed smaller than the headlines, a person who had preferred to let the ledger speak. "We can't just punish. We have to rebuild trust. We should create a fund, managed transparently with governance from the community to make sure money gets to where it is promised." Clara thought of Evelyn's shelter and of the families who had closed their doors with the ache of unpaid bills. She thought, too, of how progress could be strangled by spectacle. "If you create something," she said slowly, "it can't be another ivory tower. You'll need community oversight, a rotating board with people who actually do this work, and clear reporting that anyone can read." They designed what became the Hope Bridge Foundation with those governing principles: community seats, open ledgers, quarterly reports, and a small contingency fund for emergency needs like formula for a baby whose parent was 2 hours from panic. Clara was there in the meetings that felt like the slow building of something honest. Maggie and Helen drafted policies. Marcus made sure the technology backed transparency. Tommy, after cooperating, took a job in compliance at a different nonprofit, determined to correct his mistakes by preventing them. The trial ran in fits and starts. Crane fought. He hired seasoned counsel who argued nuance and cast suspicion on interpretations. There were motions and appeals, and then there were days where the court sat heavy and long and witnesses took stands to speak facts into microphones. Crane's defense tried to pin the case as one of bureaucratic sloppiness, not personal malfeasance. Witnesses told different stories, some troubled, some detailed, others weary. Clara testified in court with a voice that steadied as it went. She described invoices and meetings and the moment in the Bronx, where a wrong number text had become the hinge. She did not ask to be lauded for courage. She only answered. At one point, as she described a ledger entry that had made no sense, she saw Crane in the courtroom for the first time since his arrest. He sat smaller than before, his hands clenched around the edge of his legal pad. He glared at her with a private vow in his eyes. For a moment she understood the nerve-like human response to accusation, how it could hollow a person out and make them something to be afraid of or to pity. She held her gaze, and then turned it back to the questions. When the verdicts came months later, they landed like an exhale in the city. Crane was found guilty on several counts. The sentencing was less theatrical than the papers suggested it might be. There were restitution orders and fines. Some funds were retrieved through asset seizures that required complicated legal work with banks and offshore entities. The system did its slow work. It was justice in the legal sense. Not a full return of what had been lost, but enough that the pattern was interrupted. The aftermath washed over Clara in small ways. The tabloids lost interest. The community returned to work. Donations, once frozen, began to flow back as new governance structures were put in place. The Hope Bridge Foundation opened its first grant cycle with a community panel that distributed funds to programs that served children and families. Clara helped draft the application forms. She visited kitchens and shelters and sat with directors who told her about nights where milk had nearly run out. She signed off on grants that went to direct service. The numbers that once felt like weapons became instruments of repair. The personal parts of the aftermath were quieter. Ethan did not parade his involvement. He let Helen and the federal agents get the credit for the arrest because he knew how narratives would distort his motives otherwise. He called Clara sometimes to ask about reporting formats or to offer a jar of sweet potato puree he thought Lily might like. He stayed for dinners that Maggie scheduled as simple and unremarkable. He brought Lily books that had been meaningful to his own childhood, dog-eared volumes with notes in the margins about thrift and courage. They were careful with each other. Romance was a slow thing, flourishing first in the margins. Ethan babysat one evening when Clara found a flat tire and could not make daycare pickup. He sat on the curb with Lily and a thermos of warm soup and read, softly, as the little girl's eyelids drooped. He brought a roaster of food when a foundation committee met late and left it with a quiet note. For energy, no performative flourish. He listened when Clara spoke about governance and about the need to protect communities from the glare of publicity. Clara, for her part, learned to let people in on measurable terms. She reasserted the boundaries that had always mattered. She refused entertainment offers that wanted her heartbreak as spectacle. She accepted a role as the foundation's operations director, a job that let her shape policy and guard access. The role came with a modest salary and autonomy. It came with the authority to sign off on grants and to audit disbursement reports. It also came with the quiet satisfaction of being trusted to make systems that protected those the money was meant to help. Not everything healed. There were nights when she woke to the ghost of counting coins. There were moments when the tabloids' old accusations would float up and sting. But there were also mornings when a pan of formula sat in the pantry, and Lily's cheeks were round and steady. 1 year later, the scene returned to its bookends. New Year's Eve arrived and the city erupted with the same impatient brightness it had a year before. This time Clara stood on a penthouse balcony with a coat that smelled faintly of citrus, Ethan's favorite cleaner, and Lily asleep in a room with a sound machine that turned the world into a steady ocean. The penthouse looked out over the river, and the fireworks stitched the sky with familiar seams. Below, the Bronx glowed in distant pockets, and Clara felt the small tie between the two worlds like a thread of light. Evelyn's text arrived at 11:58. It was small in its language, and enormous in its warmth. So proud of you. You've kept your dignity and built a bridge. Eve. Clara let the text rest on the screen and then turned to Ethan. He stood a pace behind her, hands in the pockets of a sweater that had been palpably his in a dozen small ways. You okay? He asked, voice soft. She smiled. It's loud out there. It's always loud, he said. But it's a good kind of loud tonight. They had come a long way from the midnight knock. The wrong number text that had cracked off like a small stone had rolled into a tide of events that reshaped lives. Nothing miraculous had happened. There had been effort and risk and legal process. There had been small mercies, groceries on a threshold, a man tracing a number at 2 a.m, and large institutions bending toward accountability. Closer now, with the city's noise under them, Clara felt the warmth of Ethan's presence. They had both given things up in the months since the arrest. Ethan had given the illusion that money could fix everything. Clara had given some of her privacy. What they had gained, oddly, was each other's steadiness. He had learned how to listen without trying to engineer. She had learned how to accept help without allowing it to remove her agency. They kissed at midnight, a brief, steady thing that fit into the quiet of fireworks. It was not a sudden cinematic surrender, but a pledge. Two people who had found a shared work that began with the simplest, most human of needs. Lily stirred in her sleep, and then drifted back. On the balcony, Clara opened a message she had been saving, an email from Helen confirming that the first round of Hope Bridge grants had been executed, and that the next cycle would include a fund for emergency infant supplies. She imagined the faces of parents who would not have to count coins on a holiday. She imagined Evelyn's shelter stocking that fund. Ethan slid a small, battered business card into her hand, the same one she had kept under her pillow that first week. He had written, in his own neat script beneath the printed name, a phone number with no implication. For emergencies, he said, not charity. Clara laughed in a way that had no shame in it anymore. She pocketed the card like a preserved relic, and then dropped her hand into his. Below them, the city kept popping and cracking like the spine of a book. Above them, the sky kept tabulating small lights. Clara thought of the ledger, how it had once been a thing that exposed cold numbers and had become a mechanism to rebuild. She thought of Tommy, of Maggie, of Marcus, of Helen, of Evelyn, of people who had listened when someone refused to look away. A message arrived just after midnight. Evelyn had sent a photo of a small room with a new shelf of infant supplies and a caption that read, "Thank you for refusing to be small." Clara read it and felt the fullness of what perseverance looked like. Not a headline, but a pantry that would stay filled this week. Not the collapse of a man's career, but a system made more honest. As fireworks dwindled into a smudge of color, Ethan and Clara stood shoulder to shoulder and watched the city breathe. They had been a wrong number and a midnight surprise once. Now they were something else, an odd, chosen family stitched from the debris of systems that had failed, and the care of people who refused to let failure be the end. If you want more cinematic short stories like this, subscribe.